The kitchen air hung thick with the scent of caramelized sugar and something darker, something that clung to copper pots like a whispered confession. Dinah Bowman's hands moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent 17 years turning raw ingredients into sustenance for people who would never see her as human. The oleander blossoms outside the window nodded in the August heat, their pink petals innocent as a child's smile and twice as deadly. The year was 1856, and in the heart of Atlanta's most prestigious estate, a woman was about to finish a recipe her sister had died trying to perfect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how patience became the sharpest knife in the drawer, and how a cook's careful measurements extended far beyond flour and salt into the precise mathematics of retribution. Some dishes are best served over time, each course building toward an inevitable conclusion that arrives like the final note of a symphony played in poison and prayer. Webb Manor sprawled across 250 acres of Georgia red clay and cotton fields that stretched toward the horizon like a sea of white-capped waves. The main house rose 3 stories high, its white columns catching the morning light with the arrogant certainty of permanence, as if wealth and whitewash could stand forever against the tide of history pushing toward its shores. Colonel Harrison Webb had built his fortune on railroad contracts and human misery, transforming cotton into currency with the efficiency of a man who understood that suffering, properly managed, could be extraordinarily profitable. The kitchen occupied the back portion of the main house, separated from the formal rooms by a long hallway that carried the smell of cooking without allowing the reality of its creation to intrude on polite society. Dinah had ruled this domain for 3 years, ever since Lily's death, inheriting not just her sister's position but her unfinished business. The heavy oak table bore scars from decades of chopping, each groove a record of meals that had passed from enslaved hands to free mouths, sustaining bodies that profited from the labor that fed them. 17 years. Dinah had survived 17 years under Webb's ownership, purchased at age 17 alongside her sister when their previous master died and his estate was liquidated like furniture at auction. She remembered standing on the block in Charleston, Lily's hand gripping hers so tight their bones ground together, while men in fine suits examined their teeth and discussed their potential value with the detached interest of farmers appraising livestock. Webb had bought them both for their kitchen skills, recognizing that a plantation's reputation depended as much on the quality of its table as the productivity of its fields. The morning of August 15 began like any other, with the kitchen bell ringing at 4:30 to summon the house staff to their stations. Dinah rose from her pallet in the quarters, the thin mattress offering no comfort against the wooden slats beneath, and dressed in the darkness while Ruth's breathing continued its steady rhythm from the adjacent space. The walk to the main house took 3 minutes, long enough for the stars to remind her that some things existed beyond the boundaries of Webb Manor, brief enough that hope never had time to fully form before duty reasserted its claims. Isaac was already in the stable yard when she passed, his shoulders bent under the weight of 63 years spent serving men who measured his worth in the strength of his back. He looked up as her footsteps crunched across gravel, their eyes meeting in the communion of shared knowledge that required no words. He had loved Lily, everyone knew, though such love could only exist in stolen moments and glances that carried more weight than any vow spoken before God and witnesses. When she died, something in Isaac had died too, leaving behind a shell that performed its duties while waiting for permission to stop. The kitchen was still cool at this hour, the heat of the day not yet having penetrated thick walls designed to keep formal rooms comfortable while cooking staff sweltered. Dinah lit the stove with practiced movements, feeding kindling until flames caught and held, then adding larger pieces of oak that would burn steady through the morning's work. The cast iron stove was her instrument, its temperatures and timings as familiar as her own heartbeat, and she played it with the expertise of someone who understood that precision could mean the difference between praise and punishment. Colonel Webb demanded breakfast at precisely 7 o'clock, his internal clock regulated by decades of military service that had trained him to view unpunctuality as a personal insult. Eggs had to be cooked soft, bacon crisp but not burnt, biscuits golden and steaming, coffee strong enough to strip paint but sweetened with cream and 2 precise spoonfuls of sugar. Deviation from this routine resulted in consequences that ranged from withheld rations to visits from Silas Garrett, the overseer whose creativity with discipline had earned him a reputation that extended beyond Webb Manor into the whispered warnings shared among enslaved communities throughout the county. Dinah cracked 8 eggs into a bowl, their yolks bright as accusation against white ceramic, and began whisking with a fork that had belonged to Lily. The utensil was worn smooth from years of use, its handle shaped by her sister's grip until Dinah could almost feel Lily's presence in the metal's curves. On the shelf above the work table, hidden behind flour sacks and mason jars of preserved vegetables, sat a small leather-bound book that looked like any other recipe collection. Its pages contained instructions for cornbread and collard greens, detailed notes on pie crusts and the proper temperature for roasting chicken, all written in Lily's careful hand. But between these innocent recipes, visible only to someone who knew where to look, were other instructions. Measurements that had nothing to do with cooking. Observations about Webb's habits and preferences. Calculations of dosage and timing. The accumulated intelligence of someone who had spent years planning an execution disguised as illness, only to move too quickly, too obviously, leaving evidence that even Webb's willful blindness couldn't ignore. Lily had used foxglove, harvesting the purple flowers from the garden and steeping them into a tea she'd served with breakfast. The dose had been too large, Webb's symptoms too immediate and severe. He'd survived, barely, and Dr. Morrison had been summoned from Atlanta proper to attend his recovery. The physician had found the remains of the tea, examined the grounds, and identified the poison with the certainty of someone who'd seen similar cases before. Lily had been dragged from the kitchen before the morning was over. What happened next was never spoken of directly, but everyone in the quarters knew. Silas Garrett had taken her to the smokehouse, that windowless building where meat was cured and screams were muffled by thick walls and the sound of fires that burned day and night. She'd been inside for 3 days before they carried out her body, if the broken thing wrapped in canvas could still be called a body. Webb had made an example of her, demonstrating with methodical cruelty what happened to property that forgot its place. They'd buried Lily in the slave cemetery beyond the cotton fields, a plot of rough ground marked by wooden crosses that rotted and fell and were replaced in endless cycle. Dinah had stood beside the grave while Preacher James said words about mercy in heaven, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone trying to find comfort in promises that seemed increasingly unlikely. The red clay had swallowed her sister like the earth was hungry, and Dinah had walked back to the quarters with Isaac's hand gripping her shoulder and a fury in her chest that felt like it might crack her ribs from the inside. But fury wasn't enough. Lily's mistake had been letting rage move faster than intelligence, allowing the need for immediate satisfaction to override the careful planning that revenge required. Dinah had learned from her sister's failure, understanding that true justice demanded patience that could outlast any master's vigilance. 3 years. She'd spent 3 years establishing herself as reliable, devoted, essential to the household's smooth operation. 3 years performing grief so convincing that even Eleanor Webb had remarked on her loyalty, noting how the poor girl seemed to have learned from her sister's madness. The bacon sizzled in the pan, fat rendering out to pool at the edges while the meat crisped and curled. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dinah turned each piece with tongs, her movements economical and precise, while her mind tracked the larger recipe that had been developing since the day they lowered Lily into the ground. Oleander was more subtle than foxglove, its effects delayed and cumulative, allowing for doses so small they could be administered over weeks or months without raising suspicion. The plant grew wild throughout the South, its presence so common that no one would question its existence in Webb Manor's decorative gardens. She'd started with tiny amounts, barely enough to register, incorporating dried leaves ground into powder so fine it disappeared into the complex flavors of the elaborate meals Webb demanded. The Colonel prided himself on his sophisticated palate, requiring dishes that showcased Dinah's skills in ways that made her simultaneously valuable and vulnerable. Braised meats and wine reductions, delicate sauces that required constant attention, pastries so precisely constructed they seemed more architecture than food. Each dish was an opportunity, each meal a small deposit in the account of justice that accumulated interest with every passing day. The symptoms had begun subtly 2 months ago. Webb complained of occasional nausea, moments of dizziness that he attributed to the summer heat and his advancing age. Dr. Morrison had been summoned, performed his examinations, and prescribed rest and reduced stress, advising the colonel to perhaps moderate his business dealings and take more leisure. The diagnosis was perfect because it required no specific treatment, only time and observation, which suited Dinah's purposes precisely. She'd increased the dosage incrementally after that, watching for signs that she was approaching the threshold where cumulative damage became irreversible. Oleander attacked the heart, disrupting its electrical rhythms until the muscle forgot how to beat in coordinated fashion. Too much too fast would trigger the same suspicion that had killed Lily. Too little too slow would allow recovery and waste years of careful preparation. The balance required the same precision as baking, where a quarter teaspoon could mean the difference between perfection and failure. The breakfast tray was assembled with the care of someone arranging flowers for a funeral. Eggs on the left, their whites set but yolks still liquid enough to run when pierced. Bacon on the right, 6 strips arranged parallel like soldiers at attention. Biscuits in the center, steam rising from their split surfaces where butter was already melting into golden pools. Coffee in the silver pot that Eleanor had inherited from her mother, its surface polished to a mirror shine that reflected Dinah's face back at her in distorted fragments. She carried the tray through the hallway that separated kitchen from dining room, her footsteps silent on carpet runners that muffled sound while preserving the illusion that food appeared through magic rather than labor. The dining room was already occupied when she entered, Webb seated at the head of the table with his newspaper spread before him, Eleanor to his right working on needlepoint that would eventually become cushion covers for the formal parlor. Neither looked up when Dinah entered, acknowledging her presence with the same attention they might give furniture or wallpaper, useful but beneath notice. She placed the tray on the sideboard and began transferring items to Webb's plate with the smooth efficiency of long practice. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the coffee cup, a tremor she'd first noticed 3 weeks ago and had been monitoring with scientific interest. The shaking would worsen as cardiac function deteriorated, eventually progressing to irregular heartbeat and episodes of weakness that would crescendo into the final crisis. Virginia Webb entered the dining room as Dinah was finishing the service, her pale blue morning dress rustling against the doorframe with the whisper of expensive fabric. At 16, she occupied the uncertain space between childhood and marriage, still afforded some innocence while being prepared for the practical realities of becoming some other man's property through legal rather than literal sale. She was kinder than her parents, or at least less overtly cruel, acknowledging enslaved people with brief smiles that suggested she recognized something human in their faces even if she lacked the framework to question the system that made such recognition revolutionary. "Good morning, Dinah," Virginia said, settling into her chair with the unconscious grace of someone who'd never had to consider whether furniture would support her weight or welcome her presence. "The usual for breakfast, please." "Yes, Miss Virginia," Dinah replied, her voice carrying the carefully modulated tone that signaled deference without servility, respect without genuine feeling. She returned to the kitchen to prepare the girl's meal, lighter than her father's, consisting of toast with preserves and weak tea that Eleanor insisted was more appropriate for young ladies than the strong coffee men preferred. The kitchen had grown warm in her absence, heat from the stove beginning to fill the space with the promise of the afternoon's oppression. Ruth had arrived and was working on laundry, her hands already reddened from water hot enough to loosen stains from Webb family linens. They'd worked together for years, finding rhythm in shared silence that required no explanation or justification, 2 women performing labor that made other people's lives comfortable while their own comfort remained perpetually deferred. "How's he looking this morning?" Ruth asked without turning from her work, the question casual enough to be innocent if overheard but weighted with meaning between them. "Poorly," Dinah replied, slicing bread with a knife sharp enough to require minimal pressure. "The tremor's worse. Won't be long now." The statement hung in the steamy air like laundry on a line, visible but unremarkable, part of the landscape of their daily existence. Ruth nodded once, acknowledging the information without comment, and returned to scrubbing a stain that looked like wine or blood, the two being sometimes difficult to distinguish once they'd set into fabric. Webb Manor operated with the mechanical precision of a clock wound too tight, each gear turning in service to a mechanism designed to extract maximum value from human bodies while maintaining the fiction of benevolent paternalism. Colonel Harrison Webb had inherited the plantation framework from his father but refined it into something more insidious, replacing the crude violence of overseers with a system of psychological control that made resistance seem not just dangerous but unthinkable. The colonel's morning routine never varied. After breakfast he would retire to his study, a wood-paneled sanctum on the second floor where ledgers documented the profitable transformation of cotton into capital, where bills of sale recorded the buying and selling of human beings with the same notation used for livestock and equipment. The room smelled of tobacco and leather, masculine scents that proclaimed ownership over everything within the estate's boundaries. Here Webb conducted the business of slavery with the detached efficiency of a banker calculating interest, his correspondence filled with phrases like capital investment and depreciating assets when referring to people who cleaned his house and raised his children. Dinah had been inside the study exactly twice in 17 years. The first time was 3 days after her arrival, when Webb had summoned her to explain the household's culinary expectations with the patient condescension of someone instructing a moderately intelligent dog in new tricks. He'd stood behind his massive oak desk, its surface clear except for an inkwell and a leather-bound Bible that served more as decoration than spiritual guidance, and outlined the daily meal schedule with precision that left no room for interpretation or error. "Breakfast at 7, he'd said, his Virginia accent softening consonants until words seemed to float rather than land. "Dinner at 1, supper at 7 in the evening. On Sundays we entertain after church services, which means cold meats and salads prepared Saturday evening. Eleanor has particular preferences regarding seasoning. She finds excessive salt vulgar and will not tolerate garlic in any form. You'll receive a household allowance each Monday for purchasing necessities at market, and you'll provide detailed accounting of every expenditure. Theft will be punished severely." The second visit had come 6 months later, after Dinah had prepared a birthday feast for Preston Webb's 16th celebration. The meal had featured a crown roast with herb crust, glazed carrots, creamed potatoes, and a 3-layer cake that had required 2 days of preparation. Webb had summoned her the following morning, and she'd climbed the stairs with her heart hammering against her ribs, certain that some error had been discovered, some flaw that would result in punishment calculated to remind her that competence was expected rather than praised. Instead, Webb had gestured to a chair across from his desk, an unprecedented invitation that signaled this conversation existed outside normal hierarchies. "Sit down, Dinah. I want to discuss your sister." She'd sat, her spine rigid, hands folded in her lap while her mind raced through possible meanings, searching for the trap hidden in his words. Lily had been at Webb Manor for only 3 months at that point, still learning the kitchen's rhythms, still adjusting to the colonel's exacting standards. "Lily shows promise," Webb had continued, lighting a cigar with deliberate movements that suggested he had all the time in the world and she had only what he chose to grant. "But she lacks your discipline. She's careless with measurements, wasteful with ingredients, and her temperament is unsuited to the patience good cooking requires. I'm considering selling her to a field crew where her deficiencies would be less problematic." The statement had landed like a physical blow. Dinah's vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused on Webb's face, watching for signs of whether this was threat or negotiation, whether her response mattered or had already been predetermined by decisions made before she entered the room. "Please, sir," she'd said, the words scraping past the throat gone suddenly dry. "Give her more time. I'll work with her, teach her everything I know. She'll improve, I promise." Webb had studied her through cigar smoke that rose in lazy spirals toward the ceiling, his eyes calculating worth and leverage with the practiced assessment of someone who understood that power derived from knowing what people valued and threatening to take it away. "Your promise means nothing," he'd said finally. "But your work has been satisfactory. I'll give Lily 6 more months. If she hasn't improved to acceptable standards by then, she goes to auction. And Dinah, if you're thinking of running to spare her that fate, remember that I have contacts throughout the South. There's nowhere you could go that I couldn't recover my property." That conversation had established the dynamic that governed the next 6 years. Dinah had worked herself nearly to exhaustion teaching Lily everything she knew, drilling her on temperatures and timing until the knowledge became instinct. Lily had improved, enough to satisfy Webb's standards, enough to remain in the kitchen rather than being sold to plantation work that would have killed her within seasons. But the threat had never fully disappeared, hovering over both sisters like a storm that might break at any moment. The household operated on schedules that regulated not just labor but existence itself. The bell rang at 4:30 for kitchen staff, 5 for house servants, 5:30 for field workers. Each group had designated tasks that filled the hours between waking and whatever brief sleep could be stolen before the next day's bell. Deviation from these schedules resulted in consequences. Administered by Silas Garrett, whose position as overseer granted him authority to discipline anyone who failed to meet expectations. Garrett was a different species of cruel than Webb. Where the colonel's violence was calculated and systematic, designed to maintain productivity through fear, Garrett seemed to derive genuine pleasure from causing pain. He was a squat man with hands like slabs of meat, his face permanently reddened from sun and whiskey, his voice carrying the particular accent of poor whites who'd found status through enforcing racial hierarchies that placed them above enslaved people if below plantation owners. He lived in a cottage at the edge of the property, close enough to respond quickly to any disturbance but separate from both the main house and the quarters. His home was sparse, containing little beyond a bed, a table, and an extensive collection of implements used for punishment. Whips of various lengths and materials, each designed for different effects. Chains. Shackles. A branding iron bearing Webb's initials that had been used on 3 people in the 17 years since Dinah's arrival, marking them as permanent property after attempted escapes. Dinah had witnessed Garrett's work too many times to count, standing with other members of the household while someone was made an example of, their screams meant to educate the rest about the cost of resistance. She'd learned to keep her face empty during these exhibitions, to watch without seeing, to hear without listening, protecting some small part of herself from the trauma of enforced witnessing. But the sounds still found their way into her dreams, mixing with memories of Lily's final days until past and present became indistinguishable. The quarters where enslaved people lived occupied a row of wooden structures behind the carriage house, each building housing 6 to 8 people in conditions that barely qualified as shelter. The walls were thin enough that conversations in one cabin could be heard in the next, privacy an impossible luxury when bodies were packed together like cargo in a hold. In winter, cold seeped through gaps in the boards while inadequate fireplaces provided warmth measured in feet rather than filling entire spaces. In summer, the buildings became ovens that trapped heat and humidity until breathing felt like drowning in air. Dinah shared her cabin with Ruth, the laundress, and 2 field workers named Grace and Josephine who returned each evening too exhausted for conversation, their hands calloused from cotton that cut skin while it enriched men who'd never touched a plant except to judge its quality. The 4 women existed in uneasy intimacy, sharing space too small for secrets, learning each other's rhythms through the forced proximity of people who'd been given no choice about their living arrangements. Ruth had been at Webb Manor longer than anyone, purchased 23 years earlier when she was 17 and Eleanor Webb needed additional household staff. She'd survived through a combination of competence and calculated invisibility, making herself useful enough to be valued but not so distinctive as to attract unwanted attention. Her hands were permanently wrinkled from laundry water, her back bent from years of carrying baskets that weighed nearly as much as she did, but her mind remained sharp as the lies she used to bleach stains from fabric that cost more than her theoretical value. She was the one who'd told Dinah the full story of Lily's death, filling in details that the official narrative had omitted. How Lily had screamed for 3 days in the smokehouse while Garrett worked with methodical precision, breaking her body in ways designed to maximize pain without causing quick death. How on the 2nd day they'd heard her begging, not for mercy but for someone to finish it quickly. How by the 3rd day the sounds had stopped being recognizably human, reduced to animal noises that carried across the estate like prayers to gods who'd stopped listening. Ruth had been the one to prepare Lily's body for burial, washing away blood and worse with hands that shook despite decades of steadying themselves through trauma. She'd told Dinah that Lily's last words, gasped out during a moment of lucidity on the 2nd day, had been "finish it." Not prayers for salvation or cries for help, just those two words repeated until her voice gave out. Finish it. Dinah had understood the message wasn't about ending Lily's suffering but about completing the work she'd started. The poisoning hadn't failed because the method was wrong but because the execution had been flawed. Too much too fast, too obvious in its intent. Lily had been brilliant in her planning but had lost patience at the crucial moment, allowing rage to override the careful calculation that revenge required. The estate's daily rhythms were enforced through a combination of surveillance and informants, creating an atmosphere where trust became dangerous and paranoia necessary for survival. Webb employed a network of people who reported on conversations and behaviors, rewarding disclosure with small privileges that created hierarchies among the enslaved population. A field worker might receive reduced labor assignments for informing on someone planning to run. A house servant might get extra rations for reporting suspicious gatherings in the quarters. This system meant that resistance had to operate through layers of misdirection and plausible deniability. When Dinah began preparing for her own attempt at justice, she'd shared her intentions with exactly 3 people, and even then through implications rather than direct statements. Isaac, because his love for Lily made him a natural ally and his position in the stables gave him access to information about Webb's movements. Ruth, because their shared cabin made secrets impossible and her years of experience provided knowledge about household operations that Dinah needed. Benjamin, the house servant who'd taught himself to read by stealing newspapers from Webb's study and who could forge documents if escape became necessary. Each of them understood that knowledge carried risk. If Webb discovered the plot, everyone connected to it would face consequences that made Lily's death seem merciful by comparison. But they also understood that some things mattered more than personal safety, that witnessing systematic cruelty created obligations that couldn't be ignored without losing whatever remained of their humanity. Benjamin had been the one to suggest oleander after Dinah shared Lily's recipe book with him, recognizing that foxglove's distinctive appearance and known toxicity made it a poor choice for sustained poisoning. He'd researched the plant's properties through medical texts in Webb's library, reading late at night while supposedly cleaning, memorizing information about dosage and symptoms that he then shared with Dinah through conversations disguised as casual exchanges. The oleander grew in Eleanor Webb's garden, planted for its attractive flowers and hardy nature rather than any awareness of its lethal properties. Every part of the plant was toxic, from roots to blossoms, containing cardiac glycosides that accumulated in the body over time. Small doses produced nausea and dizziness that could be attributed to any number of causes. Larger doses caused irregular heartbeat, confusion, and eventually cardiac arrest that would appear to be natural death, especially in a man of Webb's age and temperament. Dinah had begun harvesting leaves in early spring, taking only a few from each plant to avoid creating obvious gaps that might draw attention. She dried them in the root cellar, hanging them among herbs used for legitimate cooking until they became brittle enough to grind into powder fine as flour. The process had taken weeks, accumulating enough material to sustain a campaign that might last months, building concentration in Webb's system until his heart forgot its proper rhythm. The daily administration required creativity that went beyond simple addition to food. Webb's palate was too refined to miss unfamiliar flavors, his suspicion too ingrained to accept anything that seemed unusual. So Dinah had incorporated the powder into dishes complex enough to mask its presence. The wine reductions that accompanied roasted meats, their flavors already bitter and tannic. The dark sauces made with mushrooms and beef stock where earthiness disguised any plant matter. The strong coffee Webb preferred, its robust flavor overwhelming more subtle tastes. She'd started with doses so small they registered below the threshold of detection, watching for symptoms that might indicate she'd miscalculated. The first month had produced nothing visible, and she'd wondered whether the poison was potent enough or if her grinding had somehow neutralized its properties. But then Webb had mentioned feeling momentarily dizzy while reviewing accounts, a passing complaint that Eleanor had attributed to his habit of working through meals. The symptoms had progressed from there with the inevitability of a clock winding down. Occasional nausea that Webb blamed on rich foods. Fatigue that seemed reasonable given his business pressures. The hand tremor that had appeared 3 weeks ago, subtle enough that he tried to hide it but visible to anyone watching closely. Dr. Morrison's examinations had found nothing specific, attributing the colonel's complaints to stress and age, prescribing rest that Webb was constitutionally incapable of taking. Dinah had learned to read Webb's deterioration through careful observation during meal service. The way his hand shook more severely in the mornings before steadying slightly through the day. The pallor that had crept into his complexion, giving his skin a grayish cast that powder couldn't fully disguise. The shortness of breath she'd noticed when he climbed stairs, pausing on landings with a hand pressed to his chest. Each symptom was a small victory, evidence that justice was approaching with the patient inevitability of seasons changing. But each symptom also increased the risk of discovery, the possibility that Dr. Morrison might recognize the pattern, that Webb might grow suspicious enough to investigate, that someone in the household might notice Dinah's careful attention to the colonel's health and question her interest. The greatest danger came not from Webb's family but from the other enslaved people, those who'd been broken enough to trade betrayal for small privileges. There were three that Dinah worried about particularly. Marcus, a field worker who'd informed on 2 escape attempts in exchange for lighter work assignments. Della, a young house servant who reported conversations to Eleanor in hopes of eventually being made personal maid. And Thomas, the stable hand who'd replaced Isaac's responsibilities but lacked his integrity, willing to sell information for extra rations or permission to visit his wife on a neighboring plantation. Any of them might notice something suspicious and trade that knowledge for whatever small rewards Webb offered. So Dinah had constructed layers of ordinary explanation around every action, making sure that her harvesting of herbs appeared routine, that her time in the root cellar seemed consistent with food preservation, that her attention to Webb's health came across as appropriate concern rather than vindictive monitoring. The performance was exhausting in ways that physical labor never matched. At least when scrubbing pots or kneading bread, the work ended when the task was complete. But performing loyalty required constant vigilance, every word and gesture calculated for an audience that might or might not be watching. One moment of carelessness, one slip in the mask, could undo months of planning and result in consequences that would make Lily's death seem like mercy. Preston Webb had arrived home the previous week after completing his first year at university, bringing with him the casual arrogance of young men being educated into their roles as masters. At 19 he already displayed his father's calculating nature, viewing the estate's operations with an analytical eye that saw people as units of production rather than human beings. He'd spent his first evening home touring the property with Colonel Webb, discussing improvements that might increase efficiency, suggesting that field workers who failed to meet quotas should be sold and replaced with younger, stronger laborers. Dinah had served their supper that night, listening to Preston outline his plans with the detached interest of someone discussing livestock breeding. The boy, she'd realized with cold clarity, was perhaps more dangerous than his father. Webb's cruelty came from a man shaped by his era's assumptions, capable of kindness to those he considered beneath him as long as they accepted their subordinate position. But Preston represented a new generation that had refined brutality into science, stripping away even the pretense of paternalism in favor of pure economic calculation. Virginia was different, softer in ways that seemed both promising and dangerous. She'd spent time in the quarters as a child, before Eleanor decided such contact was inappropriate, playing with children of enslaved people in a brief window when age obscured the distinctions that would later define their relationships. She remembered those friendships, Dinah had noticed, sometimes watching the field workers with expressions that suggested she recognized the injustice even if she lacked the framework to articulate or resist it. 2 weeks earlier, Virginia had found Dinah in the garden cutting herbs for that evening's meal. The girl had been reading under a magnolia tree, one of the romantic novels that Eleanor approved as suitable for young ladies, full of noble suffering and virtue rewarded. She'd looked up when Dinah approached, and instead of returning to her book had asked a question that suggested her education hadn't completely insulated her from reality. "Dinah, do you ever miss your family? The ones you had before you came here?" The question had frozen Dinah mid-step, her basket of herbs suddenly feeling heavy as iron. Every enslaved person knew that questions from white people, even sympathetic-seeming ones, carried danger. The wrong answer could be reported, could be used as evidence of discontent, could result in punishment designed to remind everyone that curiosity about enslaved people's inner lives was unwelcome. But something in Virginia's face had suggested genuine interest rather than entrapment, so Dinah had offered a carefully edited truth. "Yes, Miss Virginia. I had a mother and father in Charleston. 2 brothers. Don't know where they are now." "That must be terribly difficult," Virginia had said, her voice carrying sympathy that seemed real even if it couldn't transcend the system that made such separation possible. "I can't imagine being apart from my family." Dinah had nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and turned back toward the kitchen before the conversation could venture into territory that might require more lies than she could keep straight. But the exchange had stayed with her, a reminder that even within systems designed to dehumanize, individual humans sometimes retained capacity for empathy even when they lacked power or will to act on it. The morning routine continued its familiar pattern. Eleanor emerged from her chambers at 8, already dressed in morning clothes that required assistance to don, her hair arranged in styles that took her personal maid an hour to achieve. She took a light breakfast in her sitting room, avoiding Webb, whose presence she seemed to tolerate rather than enjoy, their marriage appearing to be a business arrangement that had produced required heirs but little affection. Eleanor's relationship with the household staff was characterized by careful distance. She issued orders through layers of intermediaries when possible, preferring not to interact directly with enslaved people except when necessary to maintain household operations. Her primary concerns seemed to be social standing and the approval of other plantation wives, her days filled with correspondence and preparations for events where status was performed through elaborate meals and careful conversation. She'd shown no particular grief when Lily died, viewing the incident as an unfortunate disruption that required finding replacement kitchen staff rather than as a human tragedy. Her only comment, delivered to Dinah the day after the burial, had been to note that such unpleasantness reflected poorly on the household and should be avoided in the future through better discipline and supervision. That conversation had crystallized something in Dinah's mind, the understanding that to people like Eleanor, enslaved people existed as problems to be managed rather than as human beings capable of suffering. Lily's torture and death registered as administrative inconvenience, memorable only because it had required adjustments to household routines. The realization had been almost liberating in its clarity, stripping away any remaining hope that appeals to humanity might find purchase in hearts that had been trained since childhood to regard black people as fundamentally different and inferior. The dinner preparations began at 10, giving Dinah 3 hours to prepare the elaborate midday meal that Webb expected. Today's menu featured roasted duck with cherry glaze, asparagus and butter sauce, roasted potatoes with rosemary, and apple tart for dessert. Each dish required precise timing and attention, the components needing to reach completion simultaneously so everything could be served at proper temperature. The duck had been hanging in the cold cellar for 3 days, aging to develop flavor and tenderness. Dinah retrieved it now, its skin pale and slightly tacky to the touch, ready to be seasoned and roasted. She prepared a rub of salt, pepper, and herbs, working the mixture under the skin with practiced fingers, then trussed the bird so it would cook evenly. Into the cavity went quartered apples and onions that would perfume the meat from inside while lending moisture to prevent drying. The oven had been heating since dawn, its temperature now perfect for the slow roasting that duck required. Dinah slid the bird onto the middle rack and closed the heavy door, adjusting the damper to maintain steady heat. 3 hours at this temperature would render the fat while crisping the skin, producing meat that fell from the bone and crackled when cut. While the duck roasted, she turned to other preparations. The cherry glaze required reduction, fresh cherries cooked with sugar and wine until the liquid thickened to coat the back of a spoon. She pitted the fruit with quick motions, her knife removing stones with surgical precision, then combined everything in a heavy pot that would distribute heat evenly. The mixture bubbled and steamed, filling the kitchen with sweetness that seemed grotesque given the darker purpose it would serve. From the leather-bound book hidden among flour sacks, Dinah had extracted the precise measurement of oleander powder needed for today's dose. The amount was smaller than a pinch of salt, barely visible against her palm, but sufficient to continue the accumulation that was destroying Webb's cardiac function one molecule at a time. She stirred it into the cherry glaze, watching the powder disappear into burgundy liquid that would soon coat the duck, impossible to distinguish from the legitimate ingredients that created the sauce's complex flavor. The asparagus required blanching before being finished in butter, the bright green spears needing to retain some firmness while becoming tender enough to cut easily. Dinah prepared a pot of boiling water and a bowl of ice water, the shock of temperature change necessary to stop cooking at the precise moment when texture reached perfection. She worked methodically, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind tracked the larger timeline of Webb's deteriorating health and the approaching moment when cumulative damage would become irreversible. Ruth entered the kitchen carrying a basket of linens, her face showing the strain of labor that never ended. She set the basket down and approached the stove, ostensibly to check the fire but actually to speak quietly enough that her words wouldn't carry beyond the immediate space. "Silas was asking about you this morning," Ruth said, her voice barely audible above the sound of bubbling cherry glaze. "Wanted to know why you've been spending so much time in the root cellar." The information sent ice through Dinah's veins despite the kitchen's heat. Garrett's interest meant danger, his questions never casual but always probing for evidence of wrongdoing he could report to Webb. "What did you tell him?" she asked, keeping her own voice level despite the fear. "Told him you've been preserving vegetables for winter, same as always. He seemed satisfied, but you should be careful. He's watching more closely lately." Dinah nodded, absorbing the warning while continuing to work on the asparagus. Garrett's scrutiny meant she'd need to adjust her patterns, perhaps suspend the poisoning temporarily to avoid raising further suspicion. But stopping now would allow Webb's body to begin recovering, purging some of the toxin that had accumulated, requiring her to start the process over. The decision carried risk either direction, action and inaction both potentially fatal. The dinner bell rang at 1 o'clock precisely, its brass voice summoning the family to table. Dinah loaded the serving cart with practiced efficiency, the duck arranged on a silver platter that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother, its surface polished to mirror brightness. The cherry glaze glistened like fresh blood, coating the bird in burgundy sweetness that disguised its darker purpose. Surrounding dishes were arranged with aesthetic care, each element positioned to create visual harmony that matched the meal's flavors. She wheeled the cart through the hallway, her footsteps silent on carpet that muffled sound while preserving the illusion that meals appeared through magic rather than hours of labor. The dining room was already occupied, Webb at the head of the table with Eleanor to his right, Preston across from his mother, Virginia beside her brother. The family resembled a painting of prosperity, their clothes expensive, their postures reflecting the confidence of people who'd never questioned their right to comfort purchased through other people's suffering. Dinah served Webb first, as protocol demanded, carving slices from the duck's breast and arranging them on his plate with the cherry glaze pulled artfully to one side. His hand shook visibly as he reached for his wine glass, the tremor pronounced enough that Eleanor noticed and frowned, though she said nothing. Preston watched his father with clinical interest, his expression suggesting calculation rather than concern, already assessing how the colonel's declining health might affect succession and business operations. The meal proceeded with conversation that touched on weather, church services, and Preston's university experiences. Webb ate with diminished appetite, Dinah noticed, pushing food around his plate rather than consuming with his usual vigor. The nausea was worsening, a sign that the poison's accumulation was approaching critical threshold. Perhaps 2 more weeks at current dosage, maybe 3, before the final crisis that would appear to be natural death from cardiac failure. Virginia ate quietly, occasionally glancing toward Dinah with expressions that seemed to carry questions she didn't know how to ask. The girl had inherited her father's intelligence but not his cruelty, creating an uncomfortable awareness that saw injustice without possessing tools to confront or change it. She would make some man a troubled wife, Dinah thought, smart enough to recognize the system's brutality but trained too thoroughly in submission to effectively resist. When the meal concluded and the family retired to their various afternoon activities, Dinah cleared the table with Ruth's help, carrying dishes back to the kitchen where they would be washed and stored until the next elaborate performance. The duck carcass would be stripped of remaining meat, the bones boiled for stock, nothing wasted because economy was expected even from people who possessed nothing. The afternoon stretched ahead with its own rhythms and demands. Laundry needed finishing. The root cellar required organizing. Preparations for supper would begin at 4. Between these tasks existed brief moments when Dinah could retreat to the small space in her mind where Lily still lived, were memories of their childhood in Charleston remained untouched by the trauma that had followed. She thought of their mother teaching them to cook, patient hands guiding smaller ones through techniques passed down through generations. Thought of their father's laugh, rare but genuine, filling their cabin with sound that drove back shadows for brief moments. Those memories were all she had left of family, preserved against the erosion of time and suffering like seeds saved for planting in soil that might never accept them. But they sustained something essential, some core of identity that slavery tried to strip away through systematic dehumanization. She was more than property. More than the labor her hands produced. More than the role Webb had assigned her. She was Dinah Bowman, daughter and sister, keeper of memories and debts that demanded payment regardless of consequences. Outside the kitchen window, oleander blossoms nodded in afternoon heat, their pink faces innocent as children despite the poison coursing through their veins. Nature understood what humans forgot, that beauty and danger could inhabit the same space, that something lovely could kill you if consumed without understanding its true nature. The plants had been there longer than Webb Manor, would remain after it crumbled, patient as justice and twice as inevitable. The scars on Dinah's back formed a language that required no translation, each raised line a sentence in the grammar of subjugation that spoke of lessons taught through leather and pain. She'd received the first when she was 19, 3 years after arriving at Webb Manor, for the crime of allowing a soufflé to fall before it reached the colonel's table. Silas Garrett had administered 10 lashes in the yard behind the kitchen, methodical strokes that painted red across Brown's skin while other household staff watched and enforced witness to what happened when perfection faltered. The second collection had come at 23, after she'd been caught teaching Lily to read using a primer stolen from Virginia's childhood books. Literacy among enslaved people violated Georgia law, threatening the careful ignorance that kept the system functioning by preventing access to abolition literature and legal frameworks. That offense had earned 20 lashes, delivered over 2 sessions because Webb believed spacing punishment increased its educational value. Between the sessions her back had begun healing, skin knitting itself together in preparation for being torn apart again, teaching her body the futility of repair. But the physical scars were maps of visible trauma, easily catalogued and understood. The deeper wounds existed in places where whips couldn't reach, carved into her sense of self through years of systematic degradation that transformed human beings into property through relentless psychological assault. She carried the memory of her first auction, standing on a platform in Charleston while men examined her teeth and prodded her muscles, discussing her potential value with the clinical detachment of farmers evaluating livestock. She'd been 17, old enough to understand what was happening but young enough to still believe some intervention might arrive, some authority might recognize the obscenity and demand its cessation. No intervention had come. The auction had proceeded with the boring efficiency of commerce, her sale documented on papers that transformed her legal status from person to thing, from subject with rights to object that could be owned. Webb had paid $800 for her, the same amount he would later pay for patience, the transaction recorded in ledgers that equated human beings with agricultural equipment and livestock. She remembered signing the bill of sale with an X, her illiteracy at that point preventing even the small dignity of writing her own name on documents that erased her personhood. The journey from Charleston to Atlanta had taken 6 days, she and Lily chained in the back of a wagon that bounced over rutted roads while the trader who'd purchased them for Webb sang hymns about salvation and divine providence. The irony of a man praising God's mercy while transporting human cargo had been lost on him, his faith apparently capable of holding contradictions that would have shattered less flexible moral frameworks. They'd stopped at night in fields or forests, chained to trees while the trader slept in his wagon, their bodies curled together for warmth and whatever comfort proximity to family could provide. Lily had been 15 then, still young enough to cry openly, her tears soaking into Dinah's shoulder during nights when the darkness seemed absolute and permanent. Dinah had whispered stories to distract her, tales their mother had told them about ancestors who'd been free, who'd lived in places where skin color determined nothing about legal status or human value. She didn't know if the stories were true or myths created to sustain hope against evidence, but they'd served their purpose, helping Lily sleep despite circumstances designed to make rest impossible. Arriving at Webb Manor had felt like descending into some circle of suffering their previous experiences hadn't prepared them for. The plantation operated with ruthless efficiency, its systems refined through generations of practice in extracting maximum labor while maintaining enough physical health to preserve property value. The quarters were worse than anything made known in Charleston, structures that barely qualified as shelter, lacking adequate heating or ventilation, designed to warehouse bodies that needed only enough rest to return to work the next day. The work itself was endless and exacting, Webb's standards requiring perfection that seemed deliberately impossible to achieve consistently. Meals had to be elaborate enough to demonstrate his wealth and sophistication but prepared with allowances so minimal that creating them required constant improvisation. Dinah had learned to stretch ingredients through techniques her mother had taught her, making luxury from scraps, creating the illusion of abundance from carefully managed scarcity. But worse than the physical demands was the psychological architecture designed to destroy solidarity and resistance. Webb employed strategies that pitted enslaved people against each other, creating hierarchies and competitions that fractured collective action. House servants received marginally better treatment than field workers, creating resentment that prevented unified resistance. Privileges were granted and withdrawn arbitrarily, teaching learned helplessness through unpredictability. Information about planned sales or punishments was deliberately withheld, keeping everyone in constant uncertainty about their immediate future. The system had broken stronger people than Dinah. She'd watched arrivals full of defiance reduced to hollow-eyed compliance within months, their spirits crushed by the relentless grinding of machinery designed specifically to destroy hope. Some had tried to run, seeking freedom in forests or swamps, only to be captured and returned for punishments that made death seem merciful. Others had chosen more permanent escapes, ending their suffering through methods that required more courage than Dinah had ever been able to summon. She'd survived through compartmentalization, creating separate spaces in her mind where different versions of herself could exist simultaneously. There was the Dinah who performed subservience for Webb, who said yes sir and kept her eyes downcast and never let her face reveal the fury churning beneath compliant surfaces. There was the Dinah who maintained relationships in the quarters, who shared what little she had, who listened to stories and offered comfort when words could provide nothing else. And there was the Dinah who remembered Charleston, who preserved memories of family and freedom, who refused to let slavery define the totality of her existence. But maintaining these separate selves required constant vigilance and effort that accumulated into exhaustion more profound than physical labor ever produced. Every interaction demanded calculation, every word waited for potential consequences, every facial expression controlled to reveal only what was safe to show. The performance never ended because the audience was always watching, ready to interpret any deviation from expected submission as evidence of dangerous thinking that required correction. Lily's presence had made survival possible during those first years. Having family within reach, someone who shared history and understood without explanation, provided anchor points that kept Dinah tethered to some sense of continuous identity. They developed coded language for dangerous conversations, ways of communicating that appeared innocent to observers but carried deeper meaning between them. A comment about weather might signal that Garrett was watching more closely. A question about seasoning could indicate that someone had informed on another worker. Their mother had taught them this skill back in Charleston, understanding that enslaved people needed methods of communication that couldn't be intercepted or understood by masters. The ability to have two conversations simultaneously, one on the surface for white ears and another beneath for those who knew how to listen, was a survival tool as essential as any physical skill. Dinah had expanded this vocabulary over years, developing increasingly sophisticated methods of conveying information that appeared mundane while carrying revolutionary implications. The night Lily died, something had broken in Dinah that couldn't be repaired through the usual compartmentalization strategies. She'd stood beside the grave while red clay swallowed her sister, and felt the careful architecture of her multiple selves collapse into singular purpose. The Dinah who performed compliance and the Dinah who remembered freedom merged into someone new, someone capable of patience so profound it resembled submission while actually being its opposite. She'd understood in that moment that survival wasn't enough anymore, that simply enduring until death or abolition arrived meant allowing Webb to win by default. Lily's failed attempt hadn't been wasted if Dinah could learn from its mistakes, if she could finish what her sister had started but with the calculation and patience their situation demanded. The decision hadn't felt like choice but like recognition of what had always been inevitable, the natural conclusion to 17 years of accumulated injustice. The transformation hadn't been immediate or complete. She'd spent months after Lily's burial simply continuing routines, performing her role while underneath something hardened and clarified. The grief was real and consuming, but it burned away everything soft and uncertain, leaving behind pure purpose refined to diamond hardness. She'd retrieved Lily's recipe book from its hiding place and studied the coded entries, understanding for the first time the full scope of her sister's planning and the specific tactical error that had resulted in discovery. Reading those pages had felt like receiving instructions from beyond death, Lily's handwriting carrying messages that transcended the grave. The calculations of dosage and timing, the observations about Webb's habits and preferences, the careful documentation of household routines that might provide opportunities, all of it revealed a mind that had been working toward justice even while performing submission. Dinah had wept over those pages, mourning not just her sister's death but the stolen brilliance that might have achieved extraordinary things if born into circumstances that recognized rather than suppressed it. She'd added her own observations to the book, continuing Lily's work while correcting for the impatience that had proven fatal. Where Lily had written about foxglove with enthusiasm that suggested she'd found the perfect solution, Dinah added notes about oleander's more subtle properties. Where Lily had planned for immediate dramatic effect, Dinah outlined strategies for gradual accumulation that would avoid suspicion. The book became a collaborative project across the boundary of death, two sisters working together despite separation to achieve what neither could accomplish alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.